Hey, internets. So one of the better happenings this November you may or may not have heard of is that Jezebel, that extremely high-quality feminist news commentary site, is dead. Well, sort of dead anyways. According to a statement from GO Media, unfortunately, our business model and the audience we serve across our network did not align with Jezebel's, which is effectively a very nice way of saying we have absolutely no idea what WTF is going on or what in the 9 layers of hell we are doing, but it appears that Misandry isn't paying as a media strategy for us anymore. After years of financial troubles, they finally fell to the same problems that Gawker Media fell to, and most of the staff has apparently been laid off. It was then sold to Pace Media slightly less than a week ago, who will attempt to rebuild it, but whether or not their attempt at resurrection will be profitable or not is another story entirely, because personally, honestly, I've never even heard of Paste Magazine until now, so I have my doubts. And other people have made some reaction videos to this failure of Jezebel and GO Media, mostly just making fun of them for being trash. All in good taste, mostly, maybe. But in this video, let's do something a bit different. I'm going to explain why the type of rhetoric Jezebel pushes was indeed misandry, or is misandry if they plan to continue through Paste. And if feminists really want to avoid the stereotype that they are misandrists, as evidenced by their latest somewhat suspicious study due to its over-reliance on subjectivity, this should give some commentary on the kind of garbage style of journalism and bad talking points they will want to avoid. Because as I'll be showing a few examples in the video, Jezebel was not good. And what exactly was wrong with Jezebel, or to be more specific, why is it that their articles tend to make sexism worse? Well, it all comes down to the problem of exaggerated victimhood. For example, imagine that the Ku Klux Klan owned a major media outlet and regularly published articles such as white people have to pay 5 times more money for the same products, or whites are victims of 99% of interracial crime. Now, both of these statements are highly exaggerated statistics that are way above the actual numbers. And if this hypothetical media outlet existed while publishing fabricated data like this, I imagine most people, especially leftists, or even just center-left liberals, or really just most people in general, would identify it as racist. And honestly, they would be correct. That would be pretty darn racist. But why would that be racist? It's not targeting any specific race, it's just exaggerating problems allegedly faced by white people. Well, the answer is really obvious, because fraudulent victimhood is just a roundabout way of spreading bigotry. It's painfully easy to reword a bigoted or sexist talking point to make it sound like victimization rather than a directly hateful attack. Victimhood tends to carry with it the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy, so a simple way to attack Group B without actually saying anything bad about Group B is to instead tell Group A that they are being oppressed by an invisible systemic force that benefits Group B. It's effectively the same device as rhetoric, just worded more cleverly and targeted differently. And going back to Jezebel, that then brings up the question, how often did Jezebel publish this kind of crap with women slotted in Group A and men slotted in Group B? The answer is a lot. So let's look at some examples of Jezebel's trashy journos doing just this. Let's start out with Ma Pink Tax. Pretty good example of this would be their article on Bad News, Ladies, the Pink Tax Starts at Birth. Now, this is honestly nothing more than just a conspiracy theory. It's this idea that the reason some women's products cost more is entirely due to some rich old men in power thinking, ha ha ha, we're going to charge the women's more because we can. When in reality, it's just supply and demand. There's also some more objective studies out there that investigated the pink tax and found that for the most part, the pink tax doesn't really exist. It exists in some categories, but in most categories, women's products are actually less expensive, which suggests that it's not only a conspiracy theory, but it's just flat out wrong, period. And so all Jezebel is really doing here is arguing through anecdote, which is unimpressive, to say the least. But of course, the real issue here goes back to that KKK example I gave. The actual effect of this article is to make female readers feel like they have been slighted, and due to how victim perceptions work, this ultimately leads to feelings of entitlement, which would come at the expense of men. For instance, feminists actually have been trying to get legislation passed to regulate the market against this entirely fabricated problem. This would obviously harm the market and give the government additional power for no real reason, which would only harm men as well. So while on its surface the pink tax may seem like harmless whining, it actually has some serious real-world consequences, and of course it works by slotting men into the oppressor class and women into the oppressed class. And this also reveals how the type of feminism that Jezebel pushes is inherently authoritarian. Their ultimate goal is getting power and government regulation to fix their alleged non-problems. They're not actually trying to push for any real cultural change, they're just using victimhood as a way to gain power. and are just manipulating women's insecurities as a means to that end. And that might seem like a really tall accusation, but as we go through more of these articles, you'll see that it's not really that far off. In fact, if anything, I'm being charitable here. For example, feast your eyes on this Ma representation puppy, who forgot to invite Chun-Li to the Mortal Kombat. Now, some people might already be familiar with this one because it was so bad that it actually became a meme. And people who are familiar with Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter know exactly why it's so ridiculous, because Chun-Li isn't in Mortal Kombat. She's from the Street Fighter franchise, not Mortal Kombat. And this is particularly funny because it shows just how little effort and research Jezebel actually puts into making sure that their articles are fact-based. And the point of the article is, again, just taking advantage of women's insecurities. The entire point of it is to just make women feel like they are victims of not being represented in films properly. Whether or not any of it is actually true is completely irrelevant to them. The goal is, yet again, to portray men in Group B of the privileged and women in the Group A of the oppressed. Facts be darned. But of course, that's just one little mix-up. Let's move on to an article type that is more site-wide in how Jezebel tackles things. Such as abortion, of which Jezebel has an entire section dedicated to many articles on abortion. Now, the thing about abortion is that people who understand philosophy understand that the reason abortion is such a difficult topic to take on is because at its core, abortion is a property rights conflict. The woman owns her body, however, the baby also owns their body. So if the woman expels the fetus before it is developed enough, it will die. So the question is whether the woman's right to her own body takes precedence over the baby's rights. It's not as cut and dry as people on both sides of the aisle try to make it seem. This is why the Libertarian Party actually doesn't internally agree on abortion. And this is also where you get compromises like evictionism entering the discussion. However, evictionism in this context of Jezebel doesn't really matter because they never really talk about it at all, period. And if you think about that for a moment, you realize it's very bizarre because Jezebel has an entire section dedicated to this topic on their website with tons and tons of articles on it. So you would at first assume that you can find some kind of in-depth analysis of said property conflict, right? No, of course not. Why would Jezebel do that? What Jezebel does instead is push a conspiracy theory / straw man that evil conservatives want to get rid of abortion purely as a way to subjugate and oppress women. And in order to push this narrative, their entire discussion on the topic has to totally ignore the property rights element. And instead, their entire coverage of the abortion debate is then centered around this ridiculous accusation. No serious talk of property rights and how it pertains to abortion can be found, at least not in any of the articles I went through. And I've gone through quite a few of them. It's all about either feelings or evil conservatives blocking abortion access to subjugate the women's, and so on and so forth. It's amazing, really. It's probably the most talked about feminist pointer throughout Jezebel's entire publication, and yet not a single look at abortion through the lens of philosophy and ethics can be found. Instead, they focus entirely on the oppression narrative and never stray from that straw man. Jezebel's strategy is thus to completely ignore what the other side of this debate has to say, and instead try to make it all about sexism. This makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever, unless, of course, you remember that what they are trying to do here is just put women in Group A and men in Group B, and then suddenly it makes perfect sense. All they're doing is just, again, the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy, and thus everything they have to say must go through this framework. Again, doing nothing more than taking advantage of the insecurities of their audience. And this oppression narrative can get really stupidly petty at times. Like, for instance, saying that the bar for men's fashion is low because Justin Bieber outfit. Now, this is about as ridiculously anecdotal you can get. Hollywood actors and movie stars and whatever and singers, they always dress in ridiculous outfits. Everyone knows this, and nobody really cares. At least not people with triple-digit IQ scores. And of course, the article goes on to complain about other things like pink tax, which I just went over is basically bogus, and a bunch of other things and reasons for why women are oppressed. That's all it really is. If I'm sounding like a broken record here, I mean, that's legitimately what Jezebel is. It is just a publication that weaponizes the language of victimhood. And that's really it. That's all they do. That's their entire business model. And in this case, it's particularly ridiculous because it's comparing apples to oranges, which is kind of a big problem with this type of brand of feminism that Jezebel tends to sell in general. Because men, as it turns out, are not women, and the men and women are thus subject to different standards. So while it may be true that men's fashion is often held to a lower standard than women's fashion, if you could even argue that since it's subjective anyways, men are held to higher regards in other aspects. For instance, how much a man earns. Generally, women aren't seen as lower value based on not earning enough money per year. However, men who are earning minimum wage absolutely are looked down upon by society. and that is absolutely used against them in the dating marketplace. So all Jezebel's really doing here is just cherry-picking the very few aspects of society where women actually have some kind of bar that they need to ascend to, and then using the mere existence of that bar to say wham and oppressed, without looking at the other side of the equation. And really, a quick look at dating site statistics shows that men don't exactly have it easy in this regard. But does Jezebel consider any of that? No, of course not. They only ever look at one side of the equation, and then they generate straw man arguments based on that single-minded look at one side of the equation. And that brings me to my conclusion on just what Jezebel is. All they really are, at the end of the day, is a big, giant cherry-picking fallacy racket. They look for tidbits of often completely irrelevant, or in some cases outright fabricated data in economics, politics, and culture and whatnot, and then they exaggerate what they cherry-picked to create the illusion that women are being oppressed. And yes, this creates misandry. As I went over in the victim perception fallacy, fake victimhood tends to manifest as narcissism and entitlement in the fake victims, which negatively affects those who are being denoted as the oppressor group. This is why the type of woman who reads Jezebel also tends to be the type of girl you don't want to date, hang around with very much, or really do anything with, period, because they have a constant chip on their shoulder based on this false belief of oppression that they live under. And what it ultimately leads to is that they vote for authoritarian measures to fix their imaginary oppression. How to fix the pink tax? Regulation and increases the state power. How to fix my wage gap? Regulation and increases the state power. How to fix my representation? Additional civil rights entitlements, and of course, more increases to state power. This is why authoritarian leftist politicians love the type of feminism that Jezebel pushes so much. It doesn't matter that it's hypocritical, and it doesn't matter that it's factually inaccurate. It's useful to them, and that's why they often fund these publications. At the end of the day, victimhood is about power, and people who believe that they are victims are exactly the kind of useful idiots that authoritarian demagogues need in order to get themselves voted into more power. And sites like Jezebel serve as the perfect propaganda delivery machine in order to generate said useful idiots. And that's really all there is to it. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, share, or leave a comment for the algorithm and all that good stuff. Till next time.